I welcome you to a new lecture on EU-Russian relations, and today we are going to talk about cooperation in a fairly new for both Russia and the European Union area. I mean justice and home affairs, or if you want a more modern terminology for that, a more modern EU terminology for that, that's cooperation in the field of freedom, security and justice. So cooperation in the field of freedom, security and justice, in fact, started from the very beginning of current EU-Russian relations, I mean from the 1990s. And the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement already contained a few provisions on that, but at the same time, because for both parties this cooperation was new and because there was an obvious lack of trust on both sides, cooperation didn't progress too far. But let's look at it in more detail. Why did parties decide to cooperate in that field? Well, firstly, they realized already at the beginning of the 1990s that all crimes, or many crimes of today, have a cross-border nature, meaning that they don't stop at the border, they actually abuse differences in the jurisdiction, in the legislation, and therefore countries have to cooperate on that. Secondly, the European Union tried to balance external and internal security, and of course many internal security risks are also linked to external problems, and vice versa. Many external problems create internal security risks, and therefore there was a need to cooperate. Thirdly, the European Union believed that quite a lot of threats were coming from Russia, be it illegal migration, illegal trafficking of drugs, human beings, or any other illicit activity. And therefore they felt that there was a need to cooperate with Russia on that in order to ensure security in the EU's territory and security in the wider continent. Close economic cooperation, of course, also meant that there was a need for this cooperation because, again, close economic links, more cross-border activities meant that people tried to use and abuse the differences, and therefore cooperation was needed. There was also a gradual shift to a more sort of like protective model on the part of both Russia and the European Union. And of course in 1995, following the accession of Finland to the European Union, Russia and the European Union got a common border. And that common border was further enlarged following the 2004 enlargement and the accession of the Baltic countries and Poland to the European Union. The Partnership and Cooperation Agreement had very few provisions, but at the same time they specified some fields of cooperation, and those were money laundering, drug trafficking, prevention of illegal migration, illegal activities in the sphere of economics, including corruption, illegal transaction of various goods, including industrial waste, counterfeiting, and illicit traffic of narcotics and psychotropic substances. So that was the domain of cooperation. And then Article 84 of the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement outlined the ways, the methods of cooperation. And those were mutual consultations, as well as technical and administrative assistance, mostly of the European Union to Russia. And administrative assistance was meant to help with the drafting of national legislation, to inform about current practices of various crime prevention or crime investigation. It was also meant to assist in improving efficiency of various institutions and in training the personnel. So those were instruments put forward in the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. The provisions were very small, very vague, and in fact if you compare Russia's involvement with the involvement of the candidate countries at the time, that was much smaller and much more limited, much more cautious on the part of the European Union. Cooperation had a very slow start, but at the same time the EU's internal developments facilitated those discussions. Firstly, in 1997 the European Union signed, and then in 1999 ratified the Amsterdam Treaty, which improved cooperation in the field of freedom, security and justice in the European Union. And therefore the European Union prepared an action plan in this field, which called for enhanced cooperation with the European Union or with Russia to counter all sorts of illegal activities. The EU also had a particular strategy of drug prevention. Russia, for its part, also considered intensifying all sorts of crime prevention for obvious reasons, because the 1990s frequently linked in the Russian perception to the complete absence of the rule of law and to the complete absence of the state from regulating all sorts of processes. And of course, the imminent enlargement of the European Union and the fact the European Union was moving towards the borders of Russia required further and deeper cooperation with Russia. And therefore, Russia and the European Union drafted an action plan in the year 2000, but how at the same time cooperation remained modest and cooperation was sort of like scattered. Some activities were very pronounced, like drug prevention or discussion of visa facilitation. Other activities, like joint investigations or extradition, were missing, in some cases for political reasons. In March 2006, Russia and the European Union further clarified their priorities. So they specified that they will fight against terrorism, including protecting the infrastructure, readiness to counteraction, planning for emergency situation. They will counter cybercrime. They will do document assistance. They will engage in border cooperation, fight against money laundering, and have some judicial cooperation on civil cases. Cooperation between the Ministry of Interior and Europol was quite difficult for quite some time. In 2003, the Ministry of Interior of Russia and the Europol signed an agreement on cooperation, which presupposed information exchange and some methodological cooperation. However, information exchange was put on hold until Russia became a member of relevant Council of Europe conventions on personal data, and until Russia brought into life a national legislation on personal data and on information protection. When in 2010 the Europol acquired the status of the agency, Russia and the European Union finally enhanced their cooperation in the field of information exchange. However, again, that dialogue remains limited, especially compared with the relevant dialogue between the European Union and other partners in the international arena. There is also a question whether information exchange in principle is sufficient for such close neighbors like Russia and the European Union, which share such a long border, which have such an impressive depth of economic relations, still despite all complications, all difficulties in bilateral relations. Key issues of open discussion were, of course, very limited. Yeah? So the public is normally worried about visa-free travel more than about anything else. And therefore, visa-free issues, in fact, started to dominate EU-Russian cooperation in the area of freedom, security, and justice. At some point, some Russian experts even said that a visa-free travel is the only thing that Russia needs from the European Union, because for the rest it can cooperate bilaterally with member states. That, of course, is an exaggeration, but at the same time it reflects very well the importance of visa issues on the part of Russia. Visa issues were, of course, important for the European Union as well, but the European Union treated them more like a political incentive, or like an incentive to drive political reforms in Russia. And therefore, despite the fact that Russia in many ways was ready for a visa-free travel, the European Union was not willing to grant visa-free travel to Russia and to the current leadership of Russia. People were also, of course, worried about illegal migration and people trafficking, and about better border management and more friendly user-friendly border regime. There are good reasons for that, because cooperation on drug prevention and crime prevention is more technical, and normally it's out of the scope of, out of the radar of attention of the general public. It's kind of nice to see a movie about it, but it doesn't normally enter your life. Yeah? Visa and border management is something that you encounter in your real day life. And if you want to travel somewhere, you have to prepare that in advance, you have to get ready. Visa-free travel also has some symbolic importance, because it shows the depth of cooperation. And of course, the EU's enlargement meant that visas were introduced in countries where they didn't exist before, like Poland, for example, or like Bulgaria. And therefore, Russia, for quite a long period of time, talked about a paper wall that was emerging in Europe, instead of an iron wall which previously existed. So visa facilitation discussions. In fact, we have to admit that practices of visas vary from one country to another country, even though many EU member states are members of the Schengen. Russians are probably the most numerous applicants for the Schengen visas, but at the same time, the proportion of Russians who really travel is really small. And this is something that we can calculate on the basis of the foreign passports that are issued in Russia, but also on the basis of the number of visas, because the European Union or the Schengen countries are set to issue about 5 million visas annually to the citizens of Russia. The issue of reciprocity is also very important, in the sense, at least for Russia, because Russia is not prepared to grant a visa-free travel to countries which keep visas for Russian citizens. Yeah, so that's a question of national pride, it's a question of reciprocity and equality. And it's in contrast to, say, Ukraine, which was ready at some point to ban visas for Schengen countries in exchange for fee-free visas for its citizens. So that's a practice which it's an asymmetric solution which has never been acceptable for Russia. Several issues are linked to visas and visa-free travel in the case of EU-Russian relations. The first one is the readmission agreement. The readmission agreements are a particular practice of the European Union, according to which the European Union agrees with its partner countries that the partner country will have to take back all illegal migrants that originate from this territory, from this partner, be they nationals of this country or nationals of any other country but transiting this partner country. The readmission agreement was an issue for Russia for quite some time, given the size of Russia. Russia was worried that it would have to transport Chinese citizens all the way from the western frontier of Russia to the eastern frontier of Russia. Chinese is just like for the sake of comparison. But at the same time, the European Union was not prepared to conclude any sort of agreement with Russia, visa-free agreement or visa facilitation agreement without any readmission agreement, and Russia eventually had to agree with that, and it turned out that the solution was not that costly for Russia when it kept its borders closed. The second issue was the issue of Russian border security. And the Russian border security is linked to the fact that in some cases borders are still missing between Russia and some post-Soviet countries. And therefore the European Union was arguing that a visa-free travel is not possible until Russia in fact seals those borders. Technically it's not quite correct, because Russia never discussed a visa-free travel for anybody who comes through Russia. The discussion has always been about visa-free travel for Russian citizens. Which brings us to the next question, to the question of passport security. The European Union, for quite a long period of time, was unhappy about Russian passport security, because to date there is no single register for internal passports in Russia. And moreover, Russia has a very liberal policy for changing names, which again was criticized by the European Union. Some new technical possibilities have always been on the radar of EU-Russian relations, meaning that actually visas might be old-fashioned if you can easily check a person at the border, or if a person can just apply electronically. Abkhazia and South Ossetia became an issue in 2008, or even before, because Russia had a particular passportization policy, issuing Russian passports to some people living in those regions, but also in Transnistria. The overall climate of cooperation, of course, plays a part. Remember that I told you that visas nowadays are more symbolic than anything else, than protective. Yeah? It's rather a sign of closeness, of cooperation, more than anything else. And last but not least, the issue of discrimination became very pronounced in EU-Russian discussions on visa facilitation, precisely because the European Union reproached Russia for discrimination during the registration. The European Union wanted Russia to abolish the issue of registration of foreigners. Foreigners have to get registered when they arrive to Russia, normally within 3 days, and sometimes that time period can be reduced. The European Union argued that that's a policy that challenges the freedom of movement, although some member states of the European Union have registration requirement in their territory as well. The European Union also included the issue of human rights per se, including those of minorities, in this issue, saying that persecution of sexual minorities might be an issue for visa-free travel, because in this case EU citizens can come to Russia without knowing about this certain discrimination and suffer as a result. It's not quite clear how visas can prevent that situation, but anyways, that was the argument of the European Union. Anyways, discussions on visa facilitation, not on visa-free travel, but on visa facilitation, started in the year 2002. And in March 2003, Russia and the European Union fixed a visa-free regime as a priority, as a long-term priority of their cooperation. That was confirmed in the roadmap on the Common Space for Freedom, Security and Justice in 2005. And as a result, as the first result, Russia and the European Union concluded a visa facilitation agreement in the year 2006, together with the readmission agreement. Both agreements were ratified and came into force in 2007. According to the visa facilitation agreement, diplomats, holders of diplomatic passports, got a visa-free travel. The rest of citizens got the obligation that they would get their visas in a 10-day period, in a period of 10 working days, and also a fee for visas was fixed. But like the visa fee was fixed at the level of €35, but later many member states of the European Union started adding to it the fee of visa centers, and that basically led to the increase of prices again. Visa facilitation agreement also introduced multiple visas for business people, for researchers, for students, so they can get a visa for a period of 5 years. This agreement is frequently criticized for its minimalist approach, precisely because it's about visa facilitation and not visa-free travel, but that was the only step available, at least for the European Union at the time. In the year 2006, Russia and the European Union also concluded an agreement on local border traffic, which allowed some member states of the European Union to introduce more flexible solutions for the residents of border regions. And such arrangements are in place with some member states of the European Union. These arrangements allow citizens of border regions to go on a visa-free basis to a neighboring country for the period up to 24 years. Visa facilitation agreements continued. In the year 2010, new Schengen rules were adopted, and that legitimized visa centers with their additional fees. But also, countries now have to explain reasons for turning down visa applications of Russian citizens in the Schengen countries and of Schengen countries in Russia. Russian citizens like in the Schengen countries. Member states increasingly called for a visa-free travel. And I mentioned here cases of Finland, Sweden, Lithuania, and Estonia. Yeah, so increasingly countries were for visa-free travel because Russians traveled more and more. They spent money, and that was good for the economy, for tourism of those countries. However, the European Union officially didn't progress any further, and there was a certain bilateral, a certain two-level game with member states saying yes, it's a good idea to have a visa-free travel, and the European Union put in more and more conditions to it. In Rostov-on-Don, at the summit between Russia and the European Union in May-June 2010, Russia tried to provide a draft treaty on the visa-free travel with clear deadlines and clear set of rules, but that didn't win the support of the European Union. In 2011, however, Russia and the European Union further clarified the preconditions for visa-free travel, and human rights, respect for human rights was one of them, including non-discrimination and respect for sexual minorities. But that also included border regime, it included passport security, and many other technical issues. That allowed to actually start discussions on a visa-free travel. And in parallel, Russia and the European Union launched a discussion on further visa facilitation for an additional group of people that would include officials, business people, NGOs. The discussions stumbled on the so-called служебные паспорта, service passports. Service passports are normally issued to people who are civil servants but not diplomats. Russia demanded a visa-free travel for them, but the European Union was not prepared to grant that. The issue was eventually sorted out in 2012 when the circle of holders of service passports in Russia was narrowed down to those who have service passports with biometric data. So the agreement on further visa facilitation was nearly ready, but was never signed due to the overall freeze on the relations that took place in 2014. In 2012, Vladimir Putin also called for a visa-free travel for the Winter Olympics, but that was, of course, by that time unrealistic because the time was short. And of course, in 2014, not only discussions on visa facilitation were suspended, but discussions on a visa-free travel were also suspended. So Russia and the European Union do not go any further at the moment, and like in many areas, these discussions are on hold. Visa facilitation issues, of course, were not the only issue of cooperation between Russia and the European Union in the area of freedom, security, and justice. Common border management was also very important, and the Frontex, the European Agency for Operational Cooperation at the External Borders, signed terms of references with the Russian Border Guard Service on the establishment of certain operational cooperation. And the idea was to exchange information on both customs and border crossing, to do some study trips, and to eventually move to a single set of inspections. So if you cross a border between Russia and Finland, you actually have to pass the Russian custom control, Russian border control, Finnish border control, and Finnish custom control. Yeah, that means 4 different controls, and sometimes people say different things at different controls depending on what they do. Yeah? So the idea behind was to have only one control, or at least 2 controls, one border control and one custom control. That, of course, remains an issue of distant future because it's very difficult to agree on provisions, and no party wants to lose its free hand in this situation. Migration is another issue of cooperation between Russia and the European Union. Russia has a very ambiguous position here. Russia is the source of migration. Yeah? Depending on the year, it holds the first or the second place in the European Union as a place of origin of migrants and asylum seekers. Russia is also a destination for migrants and asylum seekers, especially for migrants from post-Soviet area, but increasingly from various conflict zones, including from the Middle East. And Russia, of course, is a transit country, and that includes, unfortunately, human trafficking. Russia and the European Union signed a readmission agreement, which is very complex, but which works very well, because very few people try to abuse the EU-Russian border. They do exchange experience on migration, but at the same time, migration cooperation suffered a lot from the recent crisis in EU-Russian relations, but also from Syrian crisis, when quite a lot of asylum seekers from Syria used Russia as a transit country to go to the European Union, and allegedly with some assistance of security services or various public services in Russia. So in that sense, this incident severely affected trust in migration cooperation and led to to quite a bit of caution on the part of the European Union in terms of further deepening of cooperation, and that of course is further complicated by the current crisis in the relations. Lastly, cooperation that works extremely well, but cooperation that is out of the limelight is cooperation on drug prevention. Parties do quite a lot of information exchange, but also technical exchange. There is a different emphasis on Russia and the European Union because the EU pays mostly attention to flows via the Balkans and to natural drugs flowing from Central Asia to Russia, whereas Russia pays attention to southern flows and also to the flow of synthetic drugs from the European Union to Russia. But there is a lot of complementarity, and there is a general understanding of the need to fight against drugs, and therefore in 2007 a memorandum of understanding was signed between the European Monitoring Centre for Drug and Drug Addiction on the EU side and the Federal Service for Drugs Control on the Russian side. And in 2009 the European Union and Russia also started negotiating a new agreement on drug precursors, aiming to strengthen the administrative cooperation in that field. And despite the fact that EU-Russian relations in general are frozen, drug trafficking or cooperation on drug trafficking and preventing drug trafficking is still in place. It's very technical, but it still goes, and it's probably one of those fields that remains unfrozen, which is good, which allows socializing, which allows exchange of technical expertise, technical information to achieve a shared goal. So this is a very brief illustration of cooperation in the field of freedom, security and justice that Russia and the European Union have. This cooperation is very patchy because none of the parties has enough trust to the other. Overall climate of relations is not good for deepening of cooperation, especially when it comes to visas, but at the same time quite a lot of provisions are in place, and there is a good potential for deepening the discussion. And with that, I conclude this lecture on cooperation in the area of freedom, security and justice, and I welcome you to our new lectures on EU-Russian relations.